Most Americans live packed into narrow belts of steel and light, while oceans of empty land lie silent across the map. This single map reveals a bold truth. 80% of us crowd onto just a sliver of the nation. Shadows of deep harbors and roaring engines carving crimson corridors from coast to coast. Map animation showing population density, red corridors and pale hinterlands. Why do bustling cities thrive where icy wilderness and endless plains remain nearly untouched? The answer lies in forces older and stranger than you might think. Start with the lay of the land. Deep natural harbors, navigable rivers, temperate climates, and rich soils pushed settlement toward the coast, and toward the northeast corridor, the California coast, and Florida. Where mountains rise and winters bite, where the Great Plains stretch without a town for hundreds of miles, population thins and silence takes over, interior Alaska included. Then history turned. The Second World War and the post-war building of roads, ports, and factories reshaped the map. The Interstate Highway Act tied cities together, and the discovery and exploitation of oil and fuels powered a boom in manufacturing and suburban growth. Steel plants and shipyards hummed, rails choked with freight, factories ran night and day, and cities grew taller and denser. Industry became an engine of scale, and the economy of the United States grew into the largest on Earth, sending goods to every corner of the globe. At the peak, whole regions supported tens of millions of people. Ports moved cargo worth trillions of dollars, and the wealth of entire cities rivaled that of independent nations. Today, a new chapter begins. Aging infrastructure creaks, affordable housing is scarce in the densest corridors, climate change threatens coastlines and heat waves push migration patterns, and inequality leaves vast shadows even inside booming metros. Animated comparison between dense corridors and empty interior. The map asks a simple and profound question. Can the American dream reshape itself to include both the bright belts of invention and the silent plains? Or will the nation remain concentrated, leaving greatness bound to a few crowded corridors? As the map unfolds, we are left to decide where to invest our steel, our ingenuity, and our hope. Salt air hangs heavy where land meets the Atlantic, and the first sparks of American settlement clustered along these ancient shorelines for a reason. Deep harbors, carved by glaciers and tides, offered shelter and promise. In Boston, ships drawing 20 feet could glide straight to wharves, riding tidal surges that lifted them over sandbars with each new moon. The main channel stretched 27 feet at low tide, wide enough for fleets that carried timber, cotton, and dreams from distant continents. New York's harbor, a vast estuary scoured by the Hudson's currents, welcomed 1,000-ton ships by the early 19th century. 30-foot depths at the Ambrose Channel let vessels from Liverpool and Havana unload cargo directly onto bustling docks. By 1819, 60% of the nation's imports funneled through these waters, more than Philadelphia, more than Charleston, turning river mouths into the beating heart of commerce. Charleston's tide-flushed rivers coaxed ships over shallow sills, their holds packed with Carolina rice and southern cotton bound for Europe. 6 to 8 foot tides swept through the Cooper and Ashley rivers, clearing silt and keeping passage open, even as lesser ports choked with mud. These natural advantages, depth, shelter, regular tides, drew settlers and traders long before railroads or highways. Along the coasts, temperate bands kept ice at bay and growing seasons long. Here, the map glows brightest, tracing the outline of harbors and estuaries where steel hulls and wooden schooners once anchored. The land itself, shaped by water and weather, pulled people inward, always toward the next deep channel, the next river mouth, the next promise of plenty. West of the harbors, the land opens wide. Prairie grasses run for hundreds of miles, rooted in loam so deep a spade vanishes to the hilt. Early soil surveys mapped black earth stretching from Iowa to Nebraska, some layers over 3 feet thick. So rich, it could cradle wheat, corn, and cattle for generations. Rain fell in steady bands, enough to fill shallow rivers and turn the plains into the breadbasket of the world. Yet the promise of the heartland came with its own limits. Farther west, the ground rises in long stony waves. The Rockies lift from the plains like a wall, summits vaulting over 14,000 feet, snowfields glinting even in July. In these heights, thin air and rocky soil discourage all but the hardiest. Beyond, the land breaks into sagebrush and stone, where only scattered ranches and mining towns take hold. Northward, the map grows frozen. In northern Minnesota and the interior of Alaska, the earth itself turns against settlement. Permafrost locks the ground in ice for most of the year, making roads buckle and forests lean at odd angles. USGS charts show more than half of Alaska's land is frozen year-round, some layers hundreds of feet thick. Rocky Mountain pockets hold only thin islands of permafrost, but these are enough to keep valleys empty and wild. A Kansas farmer, boots dusted with loam, once wrote, "The land gives, if you know how to ask." But even he knew the limits. Where rich soil faded to rock or the ground froze hard as iron, dreams of new towns and farms withered. Still, the emptiness called to those willing to gamble on rain, sun, and the patience to wait for the earth to yield. The heartland's vastness promised plenty, but only for those who could read its moods and endure its silences. A single cut through the wilderness changed everything. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened a watery highway from Albany to Buffalo, 363 miles of hand-dug ditch and lock, linking the Atlantic with the heart of the continent. Map shows the Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo. Wheat, timber, and barrels of salt rode low in the hulls of canal boats. Freight ledgers from the first decade tell the story. Shipping costs plunged by more than 90%, turning a journey that once took weeks into a matter of days. Towns like Syracuse and Rochester sprang up almost overnight, their populations doubling and then doubling again as newcomers followed the promise of cheap land and easy transport. Steel rails soon followed water's path. Archival map fades in, showing rail lines pushing west. Railroads crisscross the land, iron lines racing west from Chicago, Omaha, and St. Louis. Congressional land grants fueled the frenzy, with maps from the 1860s showing checkerboards of promised acres stretching to the horizon. By the end of the 19th century, some counties along these corridors had quadrupled in size, their fates tied to the whistle of the next arriving train. Trade pulsed from coast to coast, and the map began to glow with new clusters, each born from the power to move goods and people farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before. Wide prairie, a wind that tastes like dust, a horizon that keeps going. Grassland stretched horizon to horizon, and the promise of free land pulled families west. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, settlers claimed more than 270 million acres, each plot measured by a surveyor's chain, staked and recorded in brittle ledgers. Sod houses and windmills dotted the plains, and towns rose where railroads and grain elevators met. But the earth could be fickle. In the 1930s, black blizzards rolled across Oklahoma and Kansas, stripping topsoil from fields, choking cattle, and blotting out the sun. Newspapers called it the Dust Bowl. Over 2.5 million people loaded their lives into battered trucks and headed for California and city factories, fleeing storms that left farms empty and main streets boarded up. Close on a factory, sparks, the smell of hot steel, the roar of engines. As war approached, the rhythm of the country changed again. In 1944, the clang of assembly lines echoed from Detroit to Pittsburgh. Shipyards and steel mills ran day and night, pouring out tanks, planes, and ammunition by the millions. Rural counties thinned as workers crowded into cities, chasing steady pay and the promise of victory. The map's brightest corridors thickened, while the heartland's emptiness grew, each boom and bust shaping where Americans would gather and where silence would settle. Oil burst from the Texas earth at Spindletop in 1901, thick and black, spraying 100 feet into the air and rewriting the fate of the Gulf Coast. Archival black and white film, crude erupting like a dark geyser. Within a year, Beaumont's population tripled, derricks crowded the horizon, and the smell of crude hung over streets of rust and steel. Decades later, the same hunger for energy drove steel drills north, reaching Prudhoe Bay in Alaska in 1968. Map animation sweeping from the Gulf to the Arctic, red dots marking oil fields. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline carved a path across frozen tundra, carrying crude from the Arctic Ocean to tankers waiting at Valdez. Well logs and pipeline permits stacked up, each one a ticket to new fortunes and new towns. The land itself seemed to answer, with roads, rail, and industry reshaping the horizon. As oil wealth pooled, it poured into concrete and asphalt, funding the federal interstate highway system. By the late 1950s, over 40,000 miles of highway stitched the nation together, turning the map into a web of commerce and migration. Time-lapse of highways knitting cities together, construction dust and roaring engines. Mortgage guarantees under the GI Bill fueled a suburban surge, with millions of homes rising in rings around every major city. Gross domestic product tables from the era show the Northeast Corridor's output rivaling entire nations, greater than France, nearly matching Japan. These were decades of breadth and scale, American ingenuity harnessed to steel and concrete. Every morning, a nurse boards a pre-dawn train in New Jersey, riding 2 hours to Manhattan. Her commute, repeated by millions, is powered by the very arteries and engines forged in the age of oil and highways. Close up on a commuter's hands, a newspaper headline, a train window sliding past skyline. The map's brightest corridors now pulse with life and strain, built on the promise of endless energy and the freedom to move. But wells decline, pipelines age, and weather grows less predictable. Can these corridors adapt, or will the American dream reroute itself across a changed landscape? What will it take, and who will lead the next great transformation? Reservoirs in the West have sunk to levels not seen in living memory. Lake Mead, once a blue giant, now rings with white scars where water once stood. Entire towns in California and Arizona ration every drop, as snowpack fades and rivers thin. On the coast, wildfires roar through forests and suburbs alike, their smoke turning noon skies to dusk from Napa to Spokane. Each summer, evacuation orders sweep through mountain valleys and city edges, leaving blackened footprints where neighborhoods stood. In Florida, tidal charts from NOAA project 2 feet of sea rise by mid-century, threatening to drown streets that already flood on sunny days. Miami's pumps run day and night, fighting the ocean's slow advance. Inland census tables tell a quieter story. Counties across the Great Plains and the Mountain West lose people each year, schools and clinics shuddering as the young drift away. The map's pale heart grows emptier, while its crowded edges strain against fire, flood, and time. In the farthest reaches of Alaska, the ground itself is slipping away. Permafrost gives way to sodden earth, the sound of settling houses, the thin, cold smell of diesel and rust. Close shot of cracked schoolhouse, leaning foundations, water pooling where a playground once was. A leader from Newtok stands before a split schoolhouse, her voice steady, edged with fatigue. She points to water pooling where children once played, and to survey stakes that mark the place the village must move again. Engineers measure the thaw in inches each year, and the cost of relocation climbs by the millions of dollars, graphics showing thaw depth and rising relocation costs. Meanwhile, the Northeast Corridor and the California coast generate more than half of the nation's economic output. Engines of commerce, ports, and endless highways. Skyscrapers, shipping yards, and factories carry the roar of industry and the weight of wealth. Places like Newtok exist on a thin margin, caught between vanishing land and budgets that cannot stretch far enough. Here, patriotism meets practicality, and compassion meets calculation. In the Great Plains, towns shrink and schools close. Wind moves across an endless sea of grass. The grain elevators stand like weathered sentinels. The land itself refuses to hold still. Wide shot of empty Main Street, a boarded school, a lone pickup kicking dust. The map shows dense bands of life along coasts and corridors, and vast, quiet rooms inland. When those empty spaces demand sacrifice, who decides what is saved and what is left behind? America's density divides are not just lines on a map. They shape every vote, every drought, every migration. As cities swell and heartlands empty, the balance of opportunity and resilience stands at a crossroads. The choices we make now will redraw the nation's future. What shape will we choose?